Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this new coffee chat, mining coffee chat, Marcus and my coffee chat that we've been initiated a little more above a month ago, and I appreciate that we seem to have another, again, the crowd of our friends that join us for this discussion. Today, in particular, I'm most happy to see some of you pop up because I think the topic that we'll be addressing with Sam is one of those topics that are extremely important in the mining world today. It's Sam Logan is an expert on security risk to mining operation, and I will have. I mean, you actually published a wonderful paper recently on criminalized activity and social responsibility, which is going to be the base of our conversation. The paper is actually available on the LinkedIn page of those coffee chats. So some of you might have had already the possibility to read it. If not, I will just ask Andreas, to one of my team member and his team member, to just add the link into the chat option of this coffee chat, so that you can actually just download it and get some. Oh, Andreas, so effective, so efficient. I mean, you actually did it just before.
There it is already. Yeah.
Unless it's a way to tell me that I should actually, speak less. That's another option also. Let me just start with what we have to do on a regular basis on this one is I need to start by just reading this little disclaimer that we have. Sorry, I'm not sharing. This is your presentation, by the way. So on this, sorry for the technical difficulties, guys. Stop share. Let's see if that works better. Not again. Okay, give me 1 second. Can you maybe just I'll do this while I'll introduce you, Sam. Do you just for the benefit of our audience, would you kindly just introduce a little bit yourself? We've known each other for quite some time. It actually feels very weird to have a conversation on Zoom with you. Usually it should be on a
right.
on a remote airport on our way to a mining site or with a terrible connection somewhere. And right now we actually have a decent connection. You're home, I assume. Can you just, while I actually look for this disclaimer, I actually will like you to introduce yourself, if you don't mind, and Southern Pulse also.
Yeah, not a problem. Hello, everyone. And I see some familiar names, so it's good to see some of you out there, including a couple folks on our team, calling in from Italy and Argentina. So yeah, my name is Sam Logan, and I'm the founder and managing partner of Southern Pulse. We are a boutique professional services firm focused on Latin America. And so over the past 15 years that we've been operating in the region with our clients, as we've evolved as a company, our focus has been more and more on helping our clients essentially avoid some of the challenges and operational disruptions that come as a result of organized criminal activity or community malalignment with business interests or unions or political risk and corruption. And oftentimes it's some combination of all the above. So Southern Pulse operates exclusively in Latin America, and even there, there's countries that, as most of you are probably aware, require more attention and focus than others. So we tend to be more active in countries like Mexico and Brazil and Argentina, Venezuela, the Northern Triangle of Central America, so Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, a little bit on the Pacific side of the Andes as well, Peru and Ecuador. So Rémi, that's just a basic primer on who I am and who we are and what we do.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sam, on this clarification. I just found what I was supposed to be reading out loud to you guys, so we should be fine now. Sorry for this kind of obligation, but the opinions expressed by today's panelists are their personal views and may not reflect the views of the organization that they represent. Whenever possible, AMI has verified the accuracy of the information provided by third parties, but does not under any circumstances accept responsibility for any inaccuracies should they remain unverified. It is expected that webinar attendees will use the information provided in this webinar in conjunction with other information and with sound management practices. AMI therefore will not assume responsibility for commercial loss due to business decisions made based on the use or non-use of the information provided in today's webinar. So as you can tell, Sam, we have this little tradition of like a hazing technique of having people having to listen to my French accent with this terrible legal noise. So now that we're done it, we can actually go directly to
Move on.
to the actual neat and interesting thing that we wanted to talk about. Yeah, exactly. As you were mentioning on just earlier, we have the pleasure to work with you on a regular basis, especially on when it comes to projects in Mexico, in Brazil, and the Andean countries. Before we actually get into what was the topic for today, which is the impact of COVID-19 on the evolution of security risks, especially through the presence of criminal organization into providing masks, into providing different supplies to communities that do not see the presence of the state. Before going to that element, can you just give us a little more of a conceptual analysis or the idea of what are the main security risks that mining companies are facing, and maybe some kind of base case practices, what you've seen that was a good operation or a good strategy from a mining company to address those security risks?
Yeah, good. Okay, really broad, open-ended
Oh, of
question.
course, yeah. We
That's
have 6 hours to talk about it, not just 1 hour.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So from our perspective, oftentimes when Southern Pulse is going to engage with an operator, so oftentimes the conversation begins with the in-country team. It may be the director of operations, it may be the security director, but the conversation usually begins around, we suspect we have an issue with theft. We suspect we have an issue with, illegal kickbacks where, someone that is close with the operation is taking advantage of relationships and their ability to control who receives what contracts to then receive on the back end of that from that vendor some sort of kickback or illicit enrichment payback scheme. And sometimes it's something that's a bit more complicated, where unions get involved and there's union negotiations or some sort of nefarious union interests that would have a negative impact on the mine directly with a blockade. Sometimes it's community issues. But ultimately, I think for us, what I could boil it down to is where as mines move from exploration to construction and then to operation, there is a tendency, I think, for there to be a focus on, okay, let's draw a fence around our operation and then let's focus on what's happening inside the fence. And as long as we are secure with what's happening inside the fence, what's happening outside the fence, we can sort of manage that. And generally what's happening outside the fence is put in the hands of corporate social responsibility folks. So you got your CSR folks, you have the folks who are dealing with the unions. Depending on the size of the mine, there may be a specialist team for that, or just maybe the general manager of the mine who deals with that. And then you've also got the corporate affairs or government relations folks. And oftentimes we found they don't talk to one another. So that's also a risk, is where you have these siloed interests and exercises. Sometimes it's because the security folks don't want to share sensitive information with human resources or CSR, vice versa. So sometimes when we come in and we begin to do what we call a system analysis, and so we look at where and how information is collected, where it pools, and how ultimately it gets to decision makers, and then what's the feedback loop down from maybe corporate or decision makers in country. And we begin to see where a lot of information is pooling in the minds of people who have conversations and don't think to share it. So, on one hand, there's risks outside the fence that are not necessarily being looked at. Do we look at our community within the view of what's happening within the criminal enterprise underworld? Do we look at the unions with regards to what's happening in the political world? So sometimes those connections aren't being made. And sometimes outside the fence, conversations aren't happening, where the government affairs person will talk to the COO, but he or she may not be talking laterally to the head of human resources or the head of CSR. So we oftentimes see that as what we see, and I'll just sort of finish here, Rémi. What we see here are what we think of as maybe 3 tiers of mining operators, where you have the smaller and what people oftentimes call juniors, and you have the mids, and then you have the larger ones, the mining majors. The ones in the middle column are the mines that are sort of growing beyond that junior, growing beyond that single asset focus, and they're beginning to look around and say, okay, we have to look at a broader range of risks and a broader range of vulnerabilities and a broader range of consequences to what we're doing. A lot of times the mining majors have more issues about communication and about that information pooling, and the mining juniors are they're a lot scrappier. They're focused on that single asset or maybe on a bunch of smaller assets. but they oftentimes realize that they've gone pretty far down the lane, and there's some folks that they don't really want to have to deal with who've already got their hands pretty deep in their pockets. So pretty broad range of options here to talk about, but that's a good initial salvo.
Well, I never said that that would be the last coffee chat I would invite you to. So there might be,
Sure.
there might be a sequel, you know.
Happy to come back. Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. I would have a follow-up question specifically on informal miners, but I wanted to rebound on something that you mentioned, which is the issue of communication between teams. And it is true that I know every time that we also get engaged with a mining company, we realize that we do a lot of progress in the first 2 or 3 days by simply ensuring that communication between teams is, let's say, we put new protocols in place, and it's very complicated for mining operators and for country managers they all have their responsibility. It's very complex to make sure that the information passes. There are always the temptation to just limit the kind of information that you share until you're sure about it, or until you're sure that there's no security breaches if you actually share it with someone else, because you might have a CSR person that might be coming from the community, which is the same community that you actually monitor in terms of security. But by just coming in and sharing this information in the ears of the country manager and then trickling down to the different teams, we actually realize the kind of already progress that you can do on the specific issue. And I know that you do it very well on the security front. We had a webinar last week with one of our partners in Africa, which is Inspact. It's a large organization that works with formalization of informal miners. And the conversation drifted towards the security case of relationship with informal miners. As you were saying, the fence between the concession and the outside, or trying to engage with those informal miners to be kind of relays and sometimes buffer zones with criminal gangs. How would you encourage in terms of best case practices, or what are elements of the relation between the mining operators and the informal traditional miners that are operating either inside the concession or the outskirts of the concessions?
Yeah, so we've looked at some of the informal mining activity in Colombia. We know it's pretty prevalent there. Historically speaking, I think Brazil has probably had the longest running, sort of subculture of garimpeiros, or informal miners. We've seen it in Suriname, a little bit in Central America, maybe less so in Mexico. But I think when it comes to the informal mining aspect, and you're sort of looking at these artisanal, subsistence miner types, you first need to understand, what's motivating them to do that. Assuming that you know who they are and where they are, because maybe you don't even know that, depending on how large your concession is. And if, for example, in Suriname, you see a lot of informal mining happening near rivers and just off of riverbanks, and they're way upstream or way downstream of where you are, and you don't even know they're there. So assuming you know where they are, it's also good to know who they are, obviously, and that could take some work. But then once you know where and who, you need to understand, what drives them, what's pushing them in that direction. Sometimes what's pushing them in that direction is simply a desire to put bread on the table. And from a CSR perspective, you may be able to open a dialogue and a discussion with them about offering them some sort of alternative employment that would be of interest. And these oftentimes, as we've seen in different jurisdictions, they always look differently. But oftentimes there's a sit down, you have to sit with the right person who's negotiating on behalf of the larger group, because oftentimes we're talking about communities that are either partially or fully indigenous communities, or you're talking about groups who otherwise have a tight social network. And so oftentimes there is a cacique, there's sort of a leader in place. And we found that oftentimes the leader, the actual true leader, is not the guy sitting at the head of the table. So you kind of have to understand those dynamics as well. This age-old practice of relationship mapping or community mapping is always very important. But then also digging beyond that and understanding, okay, now that we know who we're talking about or talking to and where they're located, we need to understand what motivates them. And can we offer them something that is as good or better, but oftentimes not as something that we're saying, hey, this is going to be good for you, but we're listening to them. We're in a posture of listening. We're saying, okay, what do you need? How can we help you? How can we partner with you? These are all fairly basic CSR techniques, right? There's nothing new here. But I find oftentimes that because of the pressures of the operation, because of the pressures of what maybe corporate or other leadership is putting on these meetings, a lot of times things are fast-tracked when they really can't be. So the last thing that I would say is, in terms of understanding the drivers behind why folks are doing this, And this is a lot of times where we're starting or entering into the conversation is, to what extent is there an organized criminal interest or some sort of corruptive element at play behind the community? So is there a corruptive element behind the community when the price of gold begins to go up? And now you have organized criminal interests that say, hey, we can get in on this. We're going to use the artisanal miners to do it. We've seen it in Colombia. We've seen it in Suriname. We've seen it in Mexico a little bit. And also, as I said, in Northern Triangle. So just a few thoughts there, Rémi. Again, I don't want to go on too long, but just a couple ideas.
It's all good. Don't worry. Actually, it looks like we rehearsed our little talk, because you just like dropped a little line that just allows me to rebound. You mentioned the price of gold that potentially could surge on top of $2,000 an ounce. We've monitoring this very closely. This will have very strong security impact and consequences, and especially in terms of incentives for criminal organization to launder money through gold mining. And we're probably will do a webinar specifically on that issue early June, if indeed prices of gold tend to surge. I'll use also the opportunity before the next question, and my next question is going to be on how COVID-19 impacts security impact, but listening to the issues. But I use the opportunity just to remember our attendants and people, that the folks that give us makes us lucky to listen to us, to just use the chat option by asking questions, because I want this to be, as always, as interactive as possible. Some people listening right now might have a specific security concerns, might want to have clarification on something that you say, Sam. Please jump on the chat with your question, and I'll just address it directly to Sam. Sam, again, just to build on the publication that you provided us, we see COVID-19's impact all across the mining sector. We actually see, obviously, COVID-19 across society and societal links, and this has very strong consequences on criminal organization. Not only in Latin America, the Camorra in Italy is being extremely strong. They were the first one to step in with the masks and equipment when the Italian government couldn't step in. This is the same thing that we're seeing across all countries. And in Latin America specifically, we've been engaging yesterday in 2 talks with one of the clients in Colombia and Peru on the fact that need to engage very strongly communities before criminal organizations do it. Can you tell us what you've seen in Mexico specifically, or can you tell us, any kind of overall picture of what are the strengths that are developing and the stronger power of criminal organization under COVID-19?
Yeah, so I'll just back up a little bit and say that the piece that we put out for, I think, a lot of people on this call and others who are sort of following these activities in Latin America, no one's going to be surprised when when we talk about an incomplete projection of sovereignty, where the capital city and thereby the federal government doesn't have complete control over all of the land inside the country's boundaries, right? That's just part of the reality of what we're looking at in many countries in Latin America, and probably could make a good argument for all countries everywhere in the world, right? So within that context, if we just look at Mexico for a moment, going back to let's say 2004 and 2005, which is when I think we would be able to trace back the beginning of the latest generation of criminal activity in Mexico. We're looking at a realization where criminal interests have always been active in communities in different ways. They've preyed upon them, they've hidden within them, they've supported them. So what we're seeing now with the face mask handouts, with the canasta básica handouts of food and other things, maybe there's diapers, maybe there's baby formula and other stuff. All of that has been going on way before COVID-19, right? So there's no surprise there. What COVID-19 has done is it's exposed the fact that the federal government and the state governments just simply aren't in place or ready to suddenly throw up a social safety net that never existed in the first place. And I think it was Warren Buffett who said that, if a bunch of people are swimming at the beach, if the tide suddenly goes out, you can see everybody who's naked, who's not. And so part of that idea points to, who was prepared and who wasn't. And so, when we look at state governments like in Guerrero in Mexico, you have a governor who is who's been, in so many ways running after so many different social issues in that state that have to do with healthcare, that have to do with education, that have to do with food. Guerrero is also particularly a very interesting state because a lot of the subsistent farmers are farming poppy, and we've seen up until recently the price of poppy to be historically low. So people who are looking to make a living by selling poppy into groups that are purchasing a cheaper product from China called fentanyl, right? They're already struggling to eat, for basic health care, for education. And then you pile on a pandemic on top of that. And so it's no wonder that in communities in Michoacan and Guerrero, where you have these community police, which in some cases are quasi-criminal elements or structures, there is an alternative source of income that these criminal elements are using now to invest in the relationship that they have with those communities. And it may not be for anything more than just to say we need to have workers to farm for us, maybe because the price of opium is going up. If we look farther north, we began seeing this as I think it was one of, it might have been El Chapo's daughter, who I think was coming out in some Mexican social media where they were doing handouts of, boxes stamped in a certain way, branded in a certain way. We saw it in Durango, we saw it in Sinaloa and in Sonora. So this is sort of more of a Cartel Pacifico or Sinaloa cartel, push out. We've seen the cartel.
Just on the thing that you were mentioning, El Chapo's daughter gave an interview to French press. I don't know why they were able to interview her what they were doing, but it was quite impressive. It was really a documentary to see how they brand El Chapo. So they have the face of El Chapo designed on their masks and designed on the product that they give, and so they were stepping in several days or weeks ahead of any kind of institutional presence. And they literally, I've seen, I'm sure like a marketing director of Coca-Cola or any kind of companies would actually learn from what they've been doing, because they were extremely well organized of how to promote El Chapo and the El Chapo brand masks.
Right. No, it's interesting. You're also putting your finger in, and this dovetails what we're talking about. Going all the way back to when we were researching the book that we did on Los Zetas. One of the ideas that came out of that, a really strong idea, was that criminal organizations develop criminal brands.
Yeah.
And those criminal brands oftentimes outlast the power and the prowess of the organization. And so what we're seeing here, exactly what you're saying, is that there's a brand, an El Chapo brand, that has outlasted the man himself. Right now he's in a supermax in Colorado, if I'm not mistaken. His sons are relevant, obviously, but El Chapo, the man, is off the playing board. Los Zetas is a very strong brand. Even today, everyone on the call knows who I'm talking about when I say that. And so when you have these groups that are pushing out, these foodstuffs and whatever in a time of COVID-19, it's an opportunity to reinforce the brand, but also an opportunity to engage in, what we call in our paper, and I think other people have already thought about. We didn't coin it or anything, but criminal social responsibility. And we set it up that way as a comparison to prompt people to think about, how are we engaging with these communities in this time right now? And you can talk about large minds that engage with 20-something different communities, or very small operations that only have 2 or 3 different communities. It's the same. How are we engaging with them right now? As we're shutting down the mine, as we're going into a safety and maintenance level of operation, before we spin back up, maybe on the 18th of May in Mexico, how have we been engaging with these folks, and how have other, let's call them non-state actors, right, been engaging with these folks? And it's just an interesting analytical lens, but it's also very practical in the case of different areas around the Americas where mining operations are cheek to jowl with organized criminal interests, and the communities are in the middle.
I'll continue on this concept of criminal entrepreneurs and criminal responsibility, which you coined in your paper, which I think was very interesting. But we have a question from the audience, and I'm just going to read it out loud. How important is it to also analyze land rights, perceived, former, or actual, of affected communities or tribes to understand root causes of conflicts? And as always, I say, every time there's going to be a question, I'm going to try to stick it right there to Sam. Well, that's not what I meant. That's my French coming in. But I'm going to bring it to your attention so that you can actually answer it right away.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. Good to hear from you. So land rights is something that is I think, as Nick is alluding to here, is oftentimes overlooked. Because in a lot of different land rights systems in the Americas, you have mining concessions that are sitting on top of ancestrally owned or community owned parcels or pieces of land. And so the right to use that land is part of an agreement that is based on a legal system that the state may adhere to, but oftentimes the communities sometimes will adhere to and sometimes won't adhere to. And so you have this constant process of juggling where you'll have local leadership from communities come in and press an interest that if operators don't see it or aren't paying attention, can hit them from a blind spot. And you know, that's an initial thought. But Rémi, I'm happy to hear from you. I know you also look at these matters.
No, we do, and especially just before I came back and the frontiers were closed. I just after PDAC, I ran to Colombia and was able to do a 4 day trip on analyzing partly, you know, security concerns around northern Antioquia and El Bolivar in Colombia. And this is exactly what you're mentioning, the clarification on land rights and perception from those communities of who owns the land rights, even if, you know, the paper trail might be there, but perception always matters. And the issue also of criminal, you know, enterprise and social responsibility of who actually provides for those that are in need in the vicinity of a mining project. It might not be, I keep hearing mining companies saying like, I'm a miner, I'm a geologist, I'm an engineer, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not here to provide for the entire, you know, communities. And the sense, it's not the heart of the work. But when you're a rational actor and you look at the price of the investment, and when I say investment, it's not only money, it's much more time and the capacity to have empathy and listen to communities, then suddenly you know, save a lot of time and money with not, you know, having to mitigate a risk because criminal actors have stepped in. And that's why I want to turn towards this concept of criminal entrepreneurs that you actually had put together. How does that affect the capacity of, you know, mining operation to sustain their development? And it's not only at times of COVID, it's also mining, you know, criminal entrepreneurs in, you know, in supply chains, criminal entrepreneurs in trucking contracts, criminal entrepreneurs in a series of relationship with mining communities. Can you just give us a little bit of the area here that you're covering and how these, you know, is evolving over the last few years and even now under COVID? That's a long question again, sorry.
It is. It's okay. And I probably won't answer all of it, but I'll touch on a few things and maybe we can follow up in the chat or maybe at a different time. But first and foremost, this idea of criminal entrepreneurs goes back a long ways to where on the first book that I wrote on the MS-13 was focused on the MS-13 activity in the U.S. But part of understanding how a street gang operates in the U.S. and interacts with its PAR organization in Central America, you have to go down to Central America and begin to look at things. So, you know, sitting down and interviewing a 22-year-old man who is the third generation of what they call guides in Spanish, guías, but what folks may call or think of as coyotes or human smugglers. And so in this exchange and me sitting down with him and getting to know his father and his grandfather, who they called the coyoton, like the big coyote, was an eye-opening experience for me, because you have a realization where in a land where there are not many economic opportunities available in the licit economy. So you can't go work at Pollo Campero, you can't go work at the mall, you can't get work in the government, you can't get work here or there or wherever. Then you begin to look around and say, well, you know, what am I going to do to put food on the table?
Yeah.
And what is the market around me demanding? How can I produce a product or a service to meet that demand? That's an entrepreneurial question, fundamentally, right? Do I have an idea that has the right product market fit that can translate into basically a lifestyle business for me, right? And so from their perspective, they don't see themselves as criminals.
Yeah.
You know, if you sit down and you talk to them, you say, well, based on this legal system and based on this and this and this, you actually are a criminal. I think they would probably see that in most cases, because these guys are, at the end of the day, rational economic actors. But that's just simply not how they see that. That's not their worldview. That's not the framework in which they're existing. And they also come historically, if you talk to someone in an older generation, they look back and they've lived through civil war, they've lived through years of corruption, they've lived through watching the elites grab everything for themselves. You know, and this is especially like in a Central American context, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the where the idea was originally born. And so then if we take this framework of saying, well, independent of whether you're selling widgets or cocaine, you can still be a rational economic actor. Then we begin applying that to different areas in which we're operating. So you look back in Guerrero in Mexico, for example, and you look at the farmer who lives in a very small community in the mountains of northern part of Guerrero, fairly remote. And this man has two options. Either he works for the mine, or he works for, in addition to possibly working for the mine, works for a contractor to the mine, or he is an amapola, he's a poppy farmer, right? In some cases, he may do both, and maybe his family gets involved in both. And so the way we positioned this in the paper was, as we watched these different mines shut down all over, because in Mexico, minings were considered essential. So they were all sort of shutting down, backing away. All of these communities say, okay, now what do we do? And if you're thinking of a shutdown over a period of time, or if we're looking ahead and we're thinking of sort of these cyclical levels of shutdown, where Mexico may say, okay, for 2 months out of the year we've got to shut down. That farmer or that mine worker's got to eat somehow, especially the non-unionized folks, because the union guys may have some options that non-union guys folks don't have.
Absolutely.
So the non-union guys then say, okay, look around, do I have a product or service that I can bring to the market? More often than not, especially in these remote portions of Latin America where criminal activity is really high, the next best option is to in some way engage in that. And these initial engagements are highly relational. It's highly driven by who do I know and in whom do I have confianza and whom do I have trust? Because if I'm going to get involved in this stuff, I need to make sure that I do so in a way that mitigates risk as much as possible to me, to my family. At the end of the day, a lot of these guys end up being cannon fodder, unfortunately. But initially, when they begin to step into it, especially if they're older, they already have a family, and they're not looking for that sort of narco lifestyle that a lot of younger folks are attracted to, especially in the northern part of Mexico.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just a self-sustaining subsistence farmer who also works for the mine. That's kind of what we're getting at in this piece, is the question of saying, well, to what extent will this base layer in the pyramid of workers at your operation be attracted to the idea of now moonlighting or now part-timing or now even full-timing as something that would be, from your perspective, criminal?
I was giving a little look at the attendance at the same time. We have a series of people from Brazil operating in Brazil. So my next question is probably going to be trying to see, I know your expertise on Mexico. I've used it extensively. I know your expertise on Central America. What's your view on Brazil? I mean, is it the same way that you would operate, looking at garimpeiros in northern Brazil that you would do in a similar situation in Mexico, the same way to collect intel, the same way to address actors, and the same way to suggest recommendations and best practices? Or do you have a specific approach usually to Brazilian operations?
Yeah, Brazil, I lived in Brazil for a long time. My wife's Brazilian. Our oldest daughter was born in Rio. I love Brazil. It saddens me to see what's happening there now. Politics aside, just the way that the country is just has been sort of stumbling and rumbling along over these past few years has been hard to watch. It's had a direct impact on a lot of our family. And I remember years ago when I started looking at the sort of criminal elements in Brazil, one of the first things that we noticed was that while in Mexico, it's true that criminality oftentimes will control a city and then control routes, highways between cities and these logistics routes. It's also true in Mexico that there are splotches of land that organized crime will control. And the maps don't ever do justice because they're just a snapshot. And I think they're oftentimes wrong. But what I've seen in Brazil, and I'd love to hear from you or from some of the folks on the call, is that obviously you have a very strong prison gang, the PCC. You have strong gangs in Sao Paulo and Recife and in Rio, and you have a strong criminal element that tends to be a bit more spread out to the south of the country. And so then when you begin to talk about the garimpeiros and the miners, I mentioned at the outset of the call that there is this long historical arc where there are academics in Brazil that I've spoken to who will say modern day Brazilian criminal interests and activity in the drug trade are almost layered completely and neatly over top of old precious and semi-precious gemstone trading. It goes back way, way, way back, maybe back to the 40s and 50s. You can maybe even go back to the illegal rubber trade, you know, if you talk about the border with Bolivia. So Brazil is always going to be reticent to be compared to any other Spanish-speaking Latin American country, right? They'll say we're Brazilian first and Latino second. So I appreciate that. But it's hard not to draw some parallels between, you know, as I was saying with the garimpeiros and the illegal miners. But I think there's also an element in Brazil where the corruption of politics and that corruptive influence, in my experience, tends to be a lot more proactive and a lot more, I don't want to say meddling, but a lot more involved. If I think about Colombia or Mexico or maybe a couple of other countries like Argentina, politicians tend to sit back and receive the corrupt ones. They set up some sort of system, and that a payment is made all the way to the top. But I've seen, like in states like in Pará, northern Brazil, Pernambuco, Rio Grande do Norte, these other states where there's more mining. Accra is another one. The local politicians, the mayors and the state level politicians, whether they're a governor, usually not a governor, but a representative level or a diputado or senator level, will tend to get more involved. And that just complicates things because now you have networks of garimpeiros that in one way or another have political coverage and political protection. And so that's just an added layer of, I think, complexity and challenge within the Brazilian context that that maybe, it may also be true in Suriname now that I think about it. But I think it's something that's also unique to Brazil.
Well,
yeah, happy to hear.
No, please. I mean, I when you mentioned Suriname, we've been active in Suriname, and I see the parallel that there is between Brazil and Suriname. Yes, one parallel that is, for example, is the sense of, let's say, sense that because the political discourse of Bolsonaro or Desi Buters in Suriname has not clearly condemned illegal mining or has not clearly gone after, you know, garimpeiros operating without any rights. I was over the phone with the Agência Nacional de Mineração on Friday for a completely different matter on you know, virtual public hearings. But the issue here that the conversation drifted towards the series of incidents that have multiplied in Brazil from, you know, employees of the Agência Nacional de Mineração that would do, let's say, environmental assessment and others, and will face the garimpeiros and some criminal miners. And the criminal miners will tell them, look, we voted for Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has told us that we had the right to mine there, which is clearly a little bit, you know, simplistic as if you're looking at it. But that's the same thing that you see around in IAM Gold properties in Suriname. The fact that there's this nepotism of Desi Buters and these close friends that are often sometimes even, you know, kind of forced down the throat of the mining, you know, legitimate.
Suriname is very, very challenging to operate because of just the insular nature of the political system. Very
exactly. And so that's where for us it becomes very interesting. And I know we've done this in the past, but to arrive with the way that we operate with mining communities and let's say the local political and economic actors of trying to reshape the narrative. I mean, I know you're much more geared on security aspects and much more, even the protocol that you're using are slightly different than the one that we're using. We're much more, let's say, on the social scientists, building bridges, building a narrative, building an understanding of, you know, creation of value for the territory. I mean, that resonates with, you know, mining communities. It doesn't resonate with criminal actors. They look at me as a freaking tree hugger and like, yeah, whatever, essentially, just go back home, do what you want to do, but I'll continue my work after. So that's where we actually are compatible, because in those regions where there is this narrative of, well, we have a right to be there, actually it's not that simple. You know, when we bring in our academic actors, when we bring our, you know, international organization actors to create, and then with the help of the press, with the help of, you know, local political and governors, to create a different narrative over mining, which takes time. It doesn't give results after a few days, but that breaks in this kind of legitimization of people that would say, hey, you know, it's the El Dorado, you know, it's the far, far west. We do what we want here, and there's no one really having any kind of data of knowledge that can actually contradict the traditional, you know, structure of the fact that we were the one ruling the land. So that's where obviously it can only be in backup or in conjunction with much more security protocols that you put in place. But that's where we fight the same fight into trying to make sure that the illegal miners or the informal miner, for example, if instead of turning to the law of the strongest and turning towards the criminal organizations and getting some money out of it or being an informer or whichever, suddenly becomes much more an asset for the traditional miners to understand that they have to go through them to sign some kind of a protocol, a deal, an agreement on how they might operate on obviously not the most promising elements of the concession, but have them on some secondary areas with the right protocol in place, making sure that there's no environmental degradation that will then spoil the reputation of the traditional or the mining company. But this is the way that by creating those relations that you can have them protect your own rights and not just fall in the hands so easily to criminal organization. There are ways that you can convince, obviously you will not convince the die-hard, very close family ties with criminalization, but you will have with the more, random or the more classic, informal miner. I'm just realizing I'm just interviewing myself right now. Let me just turn back to you, my friend.
No, it's good though. It's good.
Yeah, it's true. But when we're talking about relations, I had one question which was brought to our past webinar. It's specifically when you are a mining company taking over an existing organization, an existing project that has been run between, let's say, for several years, not implementing the correct protocols, having specific, porosity between the mine operation and the criminal organization. How do you rebuild links? How do you arrive by saying, look, we're a new company, we're going to do things differently? What would you advise after an acquisition to a mining company operating in an area with definitely insecure mining practices?
Yeah, that's that's a tough one.
We have to myself and give back to you in 5 minutes.
It's okay. So it's highly specific. I mean, right now just this morning and after this call, I'm going to be working on a piece that we're preparing for a client that's basically going to say that the person of interest you've asked us to help you understand and their network and everything, this guy's, he's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And part of the reality there is that, just as you're indicating, as you're saying, you have a mining operator that has come in and purchased, an asset from someone who was there prior, and the person who was there prior had a certain relaxed standard of security protocols or community relations activity, et cetera. So they've basically taken on an asset that that has a cancerous tumor, if for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, the first thing that we'll say is, well, let's get a correct diagnosis here. Are we talking about something that is cancerous and is going to spread? Are we talking about, in terms of looking towards the future, are we talking about something that is going to have, multiple disruptive opportunities, shut you down completely? Or are we talking about some sort of parasitic element that is, within a symbiotic relationship with you? So they need you to continue to operate so that they can continue to get paid. And so then you're going to have oftentimes what's a difficult conversation, which is, normally around this idea of illicit enrichment or extortion or some sort of level of criminal enterprise penetration inside their operation. And so depending on the size of the company, where I mentioned before, you have the juniors, the mids, and the majors, depending on that also has a big difference. And depending on who you're talking to.
Yep.
If you're talking to the head of CSR or the head of security, the conversation is best had over a couple of beers and a couple of laughs, because you're not going to really get very far. You have to get up into the corporate office if you really want to have that conversation. And ultimately it comes down to, do you want to be made aware of this stuff? In other words, are you going to have an eyes open approach, or are you going to stick your head in the sand? And that's usually my first question, because if you're going to stick your head in the sand, I'm not going to add any value, and I'm going to get out of here. I'm just going to waste your time and my time and money and everything else. So as a professional services provider, that's not a relationship I want to have. Okay. If you're going to go in with your eyes wide open, then let's talk about this. You have an extortion problem, you have this kind of problem, that kind of problem. And these are the different things that we think we can try and do to eliminate it. And of course, the first part is diagnosis, which we've just done for a client. The second part is saying, okay, this person can be removed or cannot be removed. If the person cannot be removed, can you then separate them from your operation? can you put someone else between your operation and your people and that person, so that whatever happens to that person doesn't necessarily have a negative splashback on your operation? And the negative splashback, depending on where we're talking about, can be collateral damage where someone dies. I mean, let's be honest about this. But more often than not, it can be reputational risk, where English speaking press in Canada or the US or in Europe or in Australia or South Africa gets a hold of what's going on, and they want to blow it up, and that hits your stock price. And so that's a concern. But the first point for me is always, are you willing to take this on, or are you going to ignore it? And if folks say that we're just going to ignore it, then what I say is, okay, here's a ticking time bomb. Have fun with that. If they're willing to look at it, then we say, okay, this is who you're talking about. If you're talking about a jefe de plaza, so if you're talking about someone who is the chief or the boss of the certain community where you're operating, then you have limited options. In Mexico or in Brazil, you have limited options, because if you're dealing with an institution of corruption, Rémi, and what I mean by that is that you're not dealing with corruption inside of an institution, so there may be a way around it. You're dealing with an institution that's built on corruptive practices. Then you have to realize that, okay, if I'm going to do business here, then this is now my cost of doing business. And so then the conversation becomes, well, how do we mitigate that risk? How do we mitigate that blowback? And to what level are we going to let our shareholders or our board, probably not shareholders, but to what extent are we going to let our board or other leadership in on understanding who we're dealing with, what we're dealing with? And as I'm going to have a conversation with one client here in probably the near future, my recommendation, if I'm honest, is sell the asset. Get out of there, because you've bought a bad apple, and you didn't do your due diligence in the first place. You got to get out of there. That's never what they want to hear, but my job is to speak truth to power. And if that's the truth in that moment, then that's what I'm going to say. If there's a path forward, it may be tricky, it may be difficult. You may have to negotiate. We're happy to walk through with that. But if there's no path forward, sell the asset.
Yes, no, I agree.
Nobody likes to hear that. Nobody likes to hear that,
No, but that's our job. I mean, to be honest with you, our job is not to tell the client the thing that they want to hear. I mean, you both and I, we tend to be a little bit maverick in our social relationships, and we've angered a few clients that were just maybe too soft to understand that it's a good thing to hear that there's a problem. It's a good thing to hear that people don't like you. It's it's good to hear it from us. Have this intel and navigate through it, and you have to get a hard skin and tough skin to not just be afraid at the first bad news. And obviously, I'm just have to take the opportunity. You were the one mentioning due diligences, and that's the number of time that I'm seeing mining companies or investors or large funds, let's put it this way, that have done 2 or 3 mine visits, which they won't be able to do anymore. And they tell us, don't worry, I've done the mining site tour. I don't need a third party, to help me understand the different risks. Well, gosh, I've known those assets, and some of those assets that was sold without, good credible due diligence, simply because, someone from New York or London was happy to spend a week on a mining site and interview the 2 former, let's say, guerrilleros, or the 2 former members of the El Chapo that will say, we won't ever do it again. And it's a very secure area, and they just fall for it. Like, especially if you're not veteran of Latin America like we are, there's very specific signals that you can catch up on. I'll just, we've been talking about the risk of COVID-19. I don't know if you want to react on this, but it was my next question also. We talked about the risk and impact of negative impact of COVID-19 and the rise of criminal entrepreneurs and criminal social responsibility. I'm also interested on the other side, obviously, which is a little cliche, but the opportunities that you can have through it. We've talked with a mining company in Peru that was trying to renegotiate his tracker deal that was completely played by criminal organization, using COVID-19 by saying, look, we need to abide by certain specific standards. We need to review all our different contracts. Obviously, there's it's not that simple. There's secondary consequences of pushing away a criminal actor. But is there ways that companies can surf on this situation and try to implement new practices? Despite budget costs, it's also when the market is down that you want to buy and change and invest. So tell me what you think about this.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so COVID-19 has presented a litany of opportunities in different and new ways to relate to communities, especially around healthcare. And I think there are a couple of mining majors out there that have already announced programs to donate or to pour into the sort of the local or the state level healthcare apparatus to support in that way, in a way that is public, in a way that builds brand, but also in a way that maybe shifts what used to be a complicated or challenging relationship vis-a-vis the state or local government into something that's a little bit more helpful. So now you have an opportunity where, yes, you are going to spend some money, but you have an opportunity to say, okay, this is a low-hanging fruit now because of COVID, the healthcare matter. There's all kinds of other low-hanging fruits right across the dial that include oftentimes prenatal and neonatal and early post-birth infant care, something as simple as diapers and formula and things like that. We've also seen programs that are looking at preventative care, where you see people talk about COVID-19 having more effect on folks who have pre-existing conditions, right? Obviously, obesity is one of them that people have been talking about. So then that connects to type 2 diabetes. And can you do preventative care for type 2 diabetes? We've seen people engaging in programs like that. So in a broader picture, we've seen where COVID-19 has allowed operators to begin thinking creatively about, okay, how do we interact with the state apparatus here, with the state government? And it may be up to the federal level, but we've mostly seen at the state level. How do we renew that conversation? How do we put fresh legs on the conversation that has kind of gotten old at this point, to begin supporting them in an area where clearly they're deficient? So those are some hard examples that we've seen. Again, in Mexico and in Central America. Happy to hear you share on South America. We haven't seen too much down there.
I think I'd like to react to this, but obviously we just have 8 minutes left. I wanted to mention something which I think is crucial here. When we're seeing, we might be looking at several months without the capacity for mining companies to interact with communities the way they used to do. Presential public hearings, the capacity to go knock on the door and talk to people, that's something that obviously mining companies have taken the step back on. And for obvious reason, you don't want to contaminate your workers. The last thing you want is to have the mining site to be a potential cluster of development of epidemic, and you want to have it much more seen as a safe haven. But the result is that people that used to have contacts on a weekly basis with mining representatives, whether they're CSR, whether they're operational or others, will likely just have a couple phone calls, while criminal organizations, they do take the risk of arriving just a meter away from the house and just giving the mask with a plastic bag. Okay, there's no corporate protocol. There's no, there are people that will not. I mean, you and I will be the first one on the flight despite the disease, and we'll get tested several times. Other companies do not have the luxury because they have corporate policies and so on. The problem that we're seeing now is that there's going to be a larger distance between communities and mining companies. We've been working. I wouldn't say I ruined my weekend, but I spent my entire weekend working on this concept of virtualization of public hearings for some of our partners that need to go through environmental assessment, but can't do it anymore with a classic, public hearing, presential public hearing. And the way I see that there's a potential here is that you need to be able also to digitalize your relationship with the community. Now, I'm not stupid. I know there's plenty of areas, and I spend most of my time there, where there's no internet connection, or there's limited internet connection. First of all, in this moment of isolation and social isolation, it's a great opportunity to showcase the capacity to bring internet to the community, and sometimes that has been the case, to allow them to break with their isolation. Second of all, that helps create basis for regular communication over the next 6 to 9 months, during which you might just have limited communication with communities that will then gear towards potential opposing forces to the mining project, because you left basically the field open. And so that's why, I'm just thinking about, synergies here, the importance of companies to move towards a digitalization of their community relations, because they cannot play the same game that criminal organizations are playing by just knocking on the door anymore. Right. And they need, therefore, to change their relation with mining companies. I completely used 50% of the remaining time, but please tell me what you think about this idea. Is that a good idea?
I think it's interesting. It's and we do see that yes, internet is limited, especially in mountainous regions, right? But a lot of folks know where those cell towers are. Yes. They will travel to where the cell towers are just, to get online for 20 or 30 minutes. But there's something else that we've seen and are studying right now and thinking about, and that's just simply having a radio station. And it's something that I saw work effectively in Honduras and in Costa Rica years and years ago when I was in emergency medicine and disaster relief work. And it's something that we're seeing now in the northern part of Mexico. If you think across the broad range of Durango and Zacatecas and other areas where, there's I think it's Highway 54 in Zacatecas, you'll go for miles and miles and there's no cell coverage, there's no nothing,
Yeah, right.
But you can get a radio signal.
Yeah.
And so maybe a stair step in the direction of what you're talking about could be based on some sort of radio signal. Now, obviously it's not two-way, and that's a bit difficult. But you can get messages into a radio station that can be broadcast out to the broader community.
Yeah, it's already,
so
that's
been
interesting.
interesting.
In the right direction to be present and just break with this deadlock. Yes, please continue. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you.
No, that was it. Just to have the idea of bringing in community members to sit in the radio booth is perhaps a better alternative than sending your because it's a controlled and encapsulated environment rather than sending folks out into the communities. But I look forward to following up with you on some of those ideas. I think those are pretty good.
No, most definitely. I'll just maybe wrap it up just by something which I think is important also. I tend, sometimes we have conversation with mining companies or investors that tend to tell us, look, there are secure and there are non-secure jurisdictions, meaning that we need to have the help of the security experts when we have indeed puppy production or cocaine production not far away in paramilitary groups and Clan Golfo and others, okay? My point here is, to me, there's no such thing as a secure and non-secure jurisdiction. Each jurisdiction do have their security vulnerabilities, and unfortunately, COVID-19 is going to, deepen those vulnerabilities, and therefore the incentive for individuals and groups to try to, get some money one way or another, whether it's extortion, whether it is by engaging with communities where the traditional actors, whether it's the government or the mining company, has taken a step back because of COVID-19. There are a series of risks that you need potentially to reassess and understand currently. And by engaging more with communities, by being potentially putting a little bit extra money in equipment, in masks for the community, and so on. And more than anything, time, because it's always all about time and showing you care, providing empathy, providing discussion. This is what wins hearts and minds. It's not so much the money or the equipment, but it's also taking the time to discuss with them. Unfortunately, this isolation with COVID-19 is going to make it more complex. And that's why I think the radio signals that you're mentioning is a great idea. We actually included into our recommendation this weekend for the virtual public hearing, but also the development of new media and digitalization, if it's possible, because you will save the money today that you will overly spend by trying to make up with those problems in the near future, when COVID-19 will be over, and when you and I, Sam, will be back in those little, small planes, wondering if they're going to crash one day. But at least it's part of
a single engine turbo propeller. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, but I was just going to say, one last parting thought is, one of the things that we're looking at as a result of COVID-19 is just simply an increase in economic vulnerability, and looking at these different communities from that prism, from that standpoint. And to what degree is a reduced agricultural element going to increase economic vulnerability, and all kinds of other elements, that we're looking at and saying, okay, if economic vulnerability is increasing, the mine is a fixed asset, so now they're looking to you for more support and more help. How are you going to react to that need?
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sam. Just to wrap up, I just wanted to, I don't do it enough, but to thank my team. I got one intern and two juniors helping me to put those together. Part of that job also is the fact that if you were too shy, unlike Nick, to actually share a question on chat, just send it to us and we'll send it to Sam, or we'll help you work on this. We really want this to be an avenue where we have more and more communication with the mining communities and some of the experts like Sam that can help some of the operations. So please feel free to use this as much as possible, and we'll try to provide as much resources as possible. So Sam, it was cool to see you. I don't know where next time we'll be, hopefully in Miami soon with a Cuba Libre or a whiskey somewhere.
Well, I hope so.
The next one is on you. If I recall, the next one was on you.
Yeah, I think so.
But it was a pleasure, and I wish you all, guys, a good day. It's 12 p.m. We were just on time, so that's perfect. Take care, guys. Cheers.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Rémi.